Welcome, everyone, and thanks for being patient with us while we tried to sort out our speaker log-ons. My name is Helen Wilson. I'm the co-convener of the Caring for Country Committee with Kerry Danis. I'm speaking to you from Gadigal Country in Eastern Sydney. On behalf of Australia ICOMOS and the Caring for Country Committee, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar, Burning Country, Aboriginal Fire Practice in Caring for Country. This is in our Caring for Country webinar series. Just a bit of background. Originally, a Caring for Country symposium and workshop was planned for the ICOMOS 2020 General Assembly. The General Assembly was cancelled as a consequence of COVID-19, but we had done a lot of organisation of speakers and topics, so we decided to hold a webinar series in the run-up to GA 2023, also to be held in Sydney. This is the third webinar in our Caring for Country webinars in the ICOMOS webinar series. Australia ICOMOS acknowledges that across the lands and waters, states and territories, we are meeting on the land of the first Australians. We know that this land was never ceded. And we respect the rights and interests of Australia's first people in land, culture and heritage. We acknowledge their elders past and present and support the concepts of voice, treaty and truth in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Our webinar today will firstly have a welcome, then an introduction, both to the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction and introduction to our speakers. There'll be presentations by our speakers, Ricky Archer and Victor Stephenson, and then a Q&A and discussion of key points. Just a few housekeeping announcements. This Zoom meeting will be recorded and made available later for those who can't attend. As you can see, all cameras are currently turned off. It'd be good to see everyone though. So if you wish your camera to be turned on, please use the request button to turn on your camera and we will accept your request. This is especially relevant in Q&A time. Please use your own name for security purposes on your screen title, not nicknames. Microphones will be muted. If you have comments or questions, type them in the Q&A at the start of your message. Please write your full name and country or national committee. If you'd like to speak, please click on the hand tool, switch on your video and have a light source in front of your face so we can see you. So Victor's just getting off the plane. He should be joining us soon. I'd like to introduce you to Catherine Forbes, our moderator for this session. Catherine is a member of the Caring for Country Committee and convener of the Australia and New Zealand ICOMOS Joint Scientific Committee on Risk Preparedness. Thank you, Catherine.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to check, have we got the recording on for this session?
Yes, we have. Yes.
Good. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Darug country in northern Sydney. Today, October 13, is the International Day of Disaster Risk Reduction. In light of the massive bushfires that we have experienced over recent years, both here in Australia and globally, it seems appropriate that today we consider the role of burning in caring for, managing, nurturing and sustaining country to maintain its health and resilience and its capacity to resist and recover from wildfires brought about by climate change and poor land management. In 2019, 20 and 21, bushfires caused extensive damage to the Australian landscape, including several of Australia's World Heritage areas, the Greater Blue Mountains in New South Wales, the Gondwana rainforests of New South Wales and Queensland, the Tasmanian wilderness, and Fraser Island. While some of these areas are fire country, that is country adapted to fire, Others, such as the tropical rainforests of the north and the southern alpine forests, are not. Even for those areas that are fire resilient, such as the Blue Mountains near Sydney, the scale and ferocity of the fires was far beyond the conditions that the landscape has adapted to over thousands of years. Across New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria, firefighters fought for the fires for 7 months, but could not extinguish them. The fires were self-perpetuating, generating their own weather systems. More than 50% of the fires started from lightning strikes. Embers blown many kilometres ahead of the main fire fronts by high winds enabled them to spread quickly across the country. In New South Wales, thousands of structures were destroyed, including more than 100 heritage-listed properties. These ranged from mountain huts to homesteads, dairies to historic townships, and the cultural landscape and Aboriginal cultural sites. Over 90% of the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area was severely burnt. More than 3 billion animals died. We do not know how many flora and fauna species were lost. Firemen and local residents died, and as a consequence of the thick black smoke that blanketed the country, several hundred more people died from respiratory failure. The trauma was immense. The CSIRO and the Australian Bureau of Meteorology have been monitoring the impacts of climate change for many years. The records show that temperatures are rising, rainfall is falling, extended periods of drought and extreme weather events are increasing in intensity and regularity. Bushfire seasons is increasing and the fires more intense, with megafires occurring more often. And their thick black smoke contributes to the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and thus to climate change. The image behind me, taken in the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area 9 months after the fires, shows the epigonic growth on the trees that were burnt. The green leaves clearly demonstrate nature's resilience. However, not everything in the mountains has recovered like these trees. Over recent years, there has been increasing interest in Aboriginal fire management practices as a means to maintaining the land in better condition and reducing fire risk. Today, we will discuss the traditional practice of burning country and consider some of the following questions. What is burning country? Why burn country? What are its benefits to the environment and to Aboriginal people? How does traditional burning differ from hazard reduction burns for bushfire mitigation? How can burning be used to counter climate change? What are the impacts of climate change on burning practices? And what are the barriers to the adoption of Aboriginal burning practices? I would like to introduce today's very special guest speakers, who are expert practitioners in burning country. They have learnt from their elders and committed to passing the knowledge on to future generations. Today, they have very kindly agreed to share some of their knowledge and experiences with us. Ricky Archer is CEO of the North Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance, NAILSMA, facilitates community projects across the Northern Australia and through a strong network of land and sea managers. Ricky has a background in geographical information systems, Indigenous knowledge management, and natural and cultural resource management. He is also passionate about the advancement and improvement of Indigenous livelihoods across the top end of Australia. In 2020, Ricky and NAILSMA partnered with the CSIRO to produce the guidance document, Our Knowledge, Our Way in Caring for Country. Through case studies, the guidelines promote Indigenous-led approaches to strengthening and sharing Aboriginal knowledge relating to land and sea management. They also provide guidance to Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers who seek to work together as partners on Indigenous-led research projects. Such projects provide an opportunity to expand our understanding of the science underpinning traditional knowledge systems developed over thousands of generations, and explore how traditional knowledge and modern science can work together to provide solutions to some of our world's most difficult problems, including adaptation to climate change. Victor Stephenson is co-founder of and CEO of Fire Sticks Alliance Indigenous Corporation. Victor is a fire practitioner, storyteller, filmmaker, musician, and author. He founded the Living Knowledge Place, an educational platform based on community and Indigenous teaching methods, and has co-convened the National Indigenous Fire Workshop for the past decade. Fire Sticks trains Indigenous groups all along the eastern seaboard of Australia in burning country. In February 2020, Victor released his book Fire Country, aptly subtitled How Indigenous Fire Management Could Help Save Australia. The book describes the deep relationship that exists between Aboriginal people and the land, and the traditional use of fire to manage, sustain, and keep the land healthy. It also takes us on Victor's own journey of learning from elders through living and working on country. The book demonstrates that traditional fire practice is underpinned by a deep knowledge of the land, its climate, geology, flora, fauna, and ecosystems, and an understanding of how to read the landscape and listen to its needs. Through his ongoing work, Victor has sought to assist Aboriginal communities in Australia and First Nation communities internationally to revitalise traditional knowledge and practice to heal both the land and communities so that they can thrive. Ricky and Victor will highlight the issues and opportunities that exist across vast areas of Australia and share examples of the use of Indigenous fire practice to maintain and sustain the land and illustrate its contribution to the social, physical, and economic well-being of Aboriginal communities. If you have questions during their presentations, if you please enter them through the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and provide your name and country, that would be greatly appreciated. So I'm now going to pass over to Victor. It's all yours.
Ricky Archer is speaking first, and then...
sorry, Ricky. Yes, sorry, Ricky. It's all yours, Ricky.
Thanks, Catherine. And thanks. For those who don't know me, Ricky Archer. I'm a Jungad man from North Queensland, just a couple of hours west of Cairns over the Tablelands. My current role is with NAILSMA, the North Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance, and I've been here for a number of years. Again, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for everyone's time today. I've been texting Victor in the background, and we'll just see how we go in terms of his availabilities. But I have been talking to Victor in the past to run through a few kind of aligning opportunities with the different things we wanted to talk about. But what I wanted to do was quickly just set the context from a NAILSMA perspective, and then more of a personal context to some of my thoughts and you know, what key messages I wanted to put out there in terms of burning country and talking about Aboriginal fire practices in caring for country. So to give you an idea of the scale that NAILSMA works out, you know, North Australia, we kind of cover that area there. We work closely with Indigenous groups, Indigenous ranger groups, regional organisations, research institutes, and kind of everyone else in between. We've had a lens around economic development that improves Indigenous livelihoods through the land and sea management lens. So I wanted to narrow down on some of those emerging and current opportunities where we see some success, but where we're also, you know, continuing to see some challenges and barriers that we are trying to trying to solve along the way. So NAILSMA is Indigenous-led and managed, non-for-profit, going for over 20 years. The way we like to do things, again, is using the platform and foundation of community engagement, empowering Indigenous livelihoods. We do that through a number of ways, research and innovation, and lastly, advocacy and knowledge translation. We haven't been too good in making noise about what we do and the success we have at times. And I think we're building that platform stronger to be able to give more exposure to groups on the ground that are engaged in land and sea management practices, and fire is a big part of that. And ultimately that forms our strong organisation foundation. A cool one I always like to point to, and we can use the context of fire to how we relate to this, but NAILSMA's culture-based economy is a system there that incorporates country, culture and business in a culturally appropriate way. And I'll provide some examples as we go on around how fire for us fits into that, and maybe unpack some of those different definitions of fire and some of the different frameworks that categorise that. This one here, again, for the kind of context, and I'm not sure exactly where all of our audience is dialing in from today, but to set the scale of the realities of land ownership and management in North Australia, this map paints that picture. So we've got a mix of different tenure systems there. We've got different classes of native title determinations. Mainly here we're showing exclusive native title. And you can also see the green that refer to conservation areas. For the majority of those conservation areas, there is a level of native title or Aboriginal ownership to that land where that tenure sits above or under those conservation estates. So we're roughly looking at, nearly 80% of North Australia above the 26° south line. And a lot of people don't realise the extent of Aboriginal ownership to land interests and sea interests in North Australia. So I just like to use this to set that context, and that contributes to the discussion about why we do the things we do, why there is so much exposure and practice given to land and sea management regimes, and again, particularly with the fire example. I'll keep this one in the background, but just in terms of, look, more information on NAILSMA, go to that one there, and my email, feel free to contact me anytime. I'm just going to stop sharing now and talk a bit about, things that are important to me. I wanted to set that context as we're going. Catherine, Helen, please keep me on track for timing. I'd like to leave some time for question and answers, because as we go through presentations, people do come up with a lot of questions, and sometimes we run out of time. So you've seen what NAILSMA does. You've seen a map showing that land systems and why we do things we do. Some of the specific things around fire management for us and my perspectives is, why do we do it? One, we've got a cultural obligation to care for country, and that's regardless of what tenure system you're sitting on, whether you've got a conservation estate or private land or whatever it is. No matter where you are in Australia, you're going to have a traditional owner group that has an obligation to look after their country, no matter what state it's in. And it shows the strength of that cultural obligation and responsibility, because even where lands are degraded or aren't in the best environmental condition, there's always going to be a strong link from those people to want to look after it and get it better. For traditional owners that are lucky to be in pristine parts of the country and currently practicing things like fire management, they are really lucky. So again, unpacking the reasons why we burn country, a cultural obligation is the priority. Second to that, and the nature of NAILSMA's work, is providing economic opportunities. And one of the outputs of this is been evident through the savanna burning methodology concept and framework, contributing to the carbon farming space. There are a number of Australia's targets and global targets around reduction of emissions and how fire contributes to that. Look, for me, I don't really care about Australia's targets against reducing emissions. I care about people getting out on country and burning grass, getting kids out on country, practicing knowledge, and seeing parts of their country that otherwise wouldn't be, they wouldn't have access to. And when I talk about those economic opportunities, it's not so much to bring in money to different organisations. Ultimately, in the space we're in now, there's a competitive nature of funding cycles that Indigenous groups have to compete for to be able to get investment to do the things they want to do. So this is where NAILSMA's found a middle ground and taken direction from groups on the ground on how they want to reach their aspirations. And we've found that the savanna burning kind of framework, the strength of it is it's based on a traditional knowledge. It's based on a traditional fire practice. There's obviously, Western science has contributed to the practices that we see today. But ultimately, the message I wanted to give out is that the economic outputs of these carbon projects and savanna burning in particular allow Indigenous groups to do all the other important things that they don't get funding to do. Look after country, be on country, buy a vehicle to be able to even access country, basic things like that. Where we've seen, from NAILSMA as an organisation to have a core function around economic development in a sustainable way, what we've found is there's a lot more success in these opportunities when there are activities that are linked to cultural practices. And this is why the fire story is an easy one, because you've got a system, added some Western science in there, put it through a methodology, and you've got an output. But ultimately, I want that to benefit the Indigenous groups, those practitioners, to allow them to do this type of work and other work and fulfill their cultural obligations into the future. In terms of what next and emerging opportunities, if we can kind of addressing one of those questions is how fire, for us, how fire fits into the broader system. I think sometimes we can forget about the bigger system of traditional knowledge. And look, I'll say this from a kind of practitioner perspective or looking at things on the outside. I don't profess to be an expert in anything on this space. You just realise that when you do things for long enough and you hear the same message for long enough, we adapt some responses that we can test and that have been working. So in terms of what next and how we fit fire into that broader system, is if we can develop economic opportunities off the back of fire management through that savanna burning methodology process. The precedence is there to do the same things for other important cultural aspects of country, looking after biodiversity, looking after your soil and grasses, looking after your water, your springs and your important water sites, but also coastal and marine sites. But if we can get the methodology right and the reasoning right, there is a great opportunity in how we value the cultural importance of country, our cultural heritage on country, the tangible and the intangible, looking after rock art sites, looking after scarred trees, looking after all of the physical things that are important to us on country. And again, to point it back to fire as being part of that bigger system, without correct or appropriate fire regimes, all of those other cultural assets are at threat. So to try and point out, how we fit into that bigger system, Sometimes different agencies and organisations and different audiences can just focus on the fire component of traditional knowledge without realising there's a much bigger system. And if we take on one aspect of traditional knowledge, we've also got to give value to all of the other important aspects as well, and consider it as part of a system rather than just a one-off. Some other key issues I wanted to touch on that come up a lot around, land and sea management activities and in the example of burning on country and fire. We talk about governance and the importance of governance. And I don't just mean the corporate governance. What's more appropriate for me and what I'd like to highlight more is the cultural governance of how things get done. Whenever traditional knowledge is used or integrated into a management practice, sometimes we don't get the chance to talk about cultural authority. Again, I'm flagging, I'm no cultural or authority figure. I'm just taking, the messaging we hear in the various places we work to what's important to some of the mobs on ground when it comes to sharing some of these systems and integrating them into collaborative approaches. Some areas are lucky to have strong cultural governance systems and frameworks that they still follow that have been thousands and thousands of years old. Some of them still have a lot of specific knowledge, language, stories and ceremony that go along with fire practice, and they are really lucky to have that. A lot of other country doesn't have that. My own group, we aren't as lucky. We've lost a lot of that, so we've had to, look at ways that we can, overcome those barriers and still push through in terms of the management practices that we want to do. There are obviously still challenges and barriers to that, but I think the Indigenous culture and that concept of sharing and giving knowledge is really relevant in this space. And sometimes when we compare that and look at some of those challenges between non-Indigenous sectors and other entities that don't have that same system of sharing and transition of knowledge, we do find some barriers, but in that there are also big opportunities. So some of those other questions around, challenges to the uptake of traditional knowledge and practices such as fire, we may be able to use that example there. Some of the other key issues I wanted to raise in terms of traditional knowledge isn't just one aspect. Traditional knowledge, there's a lot going on there, and it's been a system that's developed over 80,000 years. And we always get comparisons, or you hear the labelling around, Indigenous knowledge or science working with Western science and the two-way learning. Sometimes I'll push, and it might be controversial, but I'll push the one-way learning wherever I can, because we've got a traditional knowledge system that is, again, 80,000 plus years old, and we're still looking for the opportunities to strengthen the value of traditional knowledge. A lot of the time we see Western science being able to validate traditional knowledge. To me, it makes sense in my head for a system to be 80,000 years old, that it should be validating other systems that are only a few thousand years old. But anyway, that's another day and another challenge that I'll be working on. Look, another key one is we always talk about is intellectual property. You see the work, the most relevant, I think, in this space around Indigenous cultural IP framework. Terry Janke has been developing for a long time. And there are some other kind of national and global frameworks there to go off. I think a key message behind all of that is if you follow appropriate mechanisms to getting traditional knowledge, integrating it, and if you do it in the right way that follows a cultural governance framework, then you're going to be safe. You're going to be covered in terms of the IP component. NAILSMA and myself, a personal view is I will always push and support and want to see Black voices giving that message about what we're doing. you know, we talk a lot about co-design, collaboration, which is good when it's done properly. But I think there's a risk that we don't fully value Indigenous voices and input as much as we should. So behind the concept of fire management, even the broader land and sea management lens, that is a key issue that I always would like to push and promote, because in the next 10, 50, 100 years, if we don't do that properly, we're not going to have Indigenous voices leading this message. In the environmental and conservation space, lastly, I'd talk about restoration, land restoration, and fire as a key part of that. And a kind of parting message is, for me, restoration is a tool, traditional knowledge is a system. So I think we've covered, you know, a broad outlook of some of the things that are important to me. Like I said, I wanted to give more time in the question and answer session to come on, but it'll be good to hear the follow-on from Victor, and thanks again for the opportunity, and I'll be hanging around for our question and answers. Thanks, Helen and Cathy.
Thank you very, very much, Ricky. Victor, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, I'm glad you've made it. So,
yeah,
have you got somewhere that you can talk now?
Everything's fine. Everything's fine. Yeah. It's just I don't know why people want to change the time, daylight saving. They should be happy where they are and with what we already are in time. But yeah,
yes, for everybody who's overseas, New South Wales has changed our time zone over the last week, and therefore it was a little bit confusing today. So Victor, it's up to you now.
Thanks very much, and and thanks Ricky as well for that great presentation. I've been listening the whole way along since you first started there. My name is Victor Stevenson. I'm a Takalak descendant from North Queensland, and I'm also the fire practitioner for Fire Sticks Alliance. Fire Sticks Alliance is a community-based organisation, and we're a non-for-profit. And basically, it was developed over the last 15 years of doing workshops around the country, supporting traditional owners with the rebuilding of knowledge. And through those years, there was a big need to support those communities because they wanted to then undertake the management of their own lands. And like Ricky has said, the immense opportunities that come from traditional knowledge through the landscapes. And there's so many more ways that traditional knowledge can support our current world and solutions and improve lifestyles and also improve culture as a whole across the country. And I feel that's an influence that can also support Indigenous peoples and countries all over the world. It's really important that communities are getting this support, because when we look at the past, Aboriginal people have never had the voice, and we've always struggled to get things on the table. And to this point now of doing this work, it's all just been, let's just make it happen. So developing our own research methods, methodologies, and also developing our own training courses, and creating our own workshops and in ways to support communities. We do have a base of knowledge, and that's been supported by a number of elders supporting the base of knowledge to support the programs, including two very special elders, Dr. Tom George and Dr. George Musgrave, who are now passed now. But things have carried on that legacy, and that legacy continues to carry on from old people from even further back for all Aboriginal people. And right across Australia, Aboriginal people have contributed to this amazing work. Whether we work together or whether we don't, it's all a contribution as a whole to really get the voice out there to the world and across our nation that Aboriginal knowledge is important for our futures. And first of all, it's really important for our futures because, of employment, to get out of the social problems within communities, to improve our education systems, and that's really important in terms of for the people. And that's always been a struggle since colonization to get that happening. So, but on top of that, we're in a time where climate change is among us, and where the bad management of land over the many years in this country has mounted up to, a huge mess that needs to clean up. And we're currently in a healing stage in this country that is not within our lifetimes, but it's more intergenerational. And it's something that the future generations have inherited now, the problems within landscapes, the problems with loss of culture and knowledge. And that is alarming for Aboriginal people, but it's also alarming for everybody, because this country is shared by everybody. And when we look at the future for all our children, both white and Indigenous and non-Indigenous, then it's crucial that we're starting that process in trying to heal and put our younger generations on the right track into the future. And when we look at any aspiration of the old people, no matter where they are in Australia or no matter where they are in the world, there's one main aspiration, and that is to get on country, to look after the land and get the young people there and educated with that knowledge. And that's every elder's dream. And then if you close your eyes and listen to any elder around the world, you'll listen that they're all saying the same thing about the problems within the landscape, and also the problems we're facing with governments and general society in trying to get this happening, the challenges around that. It's it's so important when you look at thousands of years of knowledge, a knowledge system that's so old. And when we look at today's society, they haven't valued that. And now we're in a situation where, this knowledge is so crucial to fast-tracking solutions and to getting projects on the ground happening quickly and getting our communities engaged and creating opportunity. And a lot of since the wildfires in Australia in 2019, and even before that, there's always been wildfires right to the 1900s and even before, when settlement first came to Australia, when the management stopped. But since those major fires in 19, there's been a huge interest in Aboriginal fire management, and that's something that that has come off the back of all the work that Aboriginal people have done prior around the country, including NALSMA and fire sticks and all communities that are running their own ranger programs. It's just a credit to everybody that's been doing this important work and contributing to that. And so with Fire Sticks ourselves, we've gone down the road to having to create those training courses to help communities to rebuild their knowledge. And a lot of communities can be fortunate and a lot of them can be unfortunate when it comes to traditional knowledge, with the loss of knowledge and what's happened in the past. And so we need to step on stepping stones that have been missed in the past. And that is the journey now to start to revive knowledge, to develop the training, to get the programs on, and to start to build the skill levels and the opportunities for the younger ones to follow, to take on the immense work that we're about to take on as humanity on this planet. Because when we look at the problems around Australia, just Australia alone, we have a huge mass extinction problem of plants and animals. And we have huge problems with also associated, as we mentioned, and it's not going to get any greater if we don't start acting now and start looking after the land better. And this is something that's been sort of the hidden sort of side of climate change and the issues that are going on now around carbon and around vehicles and fossil fuels. Everyone's talking about that side, and that's really important. But also just as important and equally as important and probably crucial is the fact that we need to be looking after our land much better than what we're doing. And we need to have a culture right across the board for non-Indigenous and Indigenous to actually be more connected to the landscapes a lot more closely. Because one thing that Aboriginal people have done and demonstrated right across the world is that, connecting to the land and having a culture connected to land, looking after the land is the key to sustainability. And that's an intelligence that modern society doesn't have anymore. And so when we look at that as a picture, then we've got a huge job ahead of us because, we live in a world where people, they don't have that methodology and, looking after the land anymore, or knowledge and that extent. And so it's really important that Aboriginal people have that place and voice to be able to demonstrate that knowledge. And that's what we've done over the years, is just dodge the hoops and get around all the bureaucracy and just get out there and try and demonstrate as much as possible. And that's the language of Aboriginal teaching is practical demonstrations and being practical and not theory. And that is why it's really crucial that we are getting the opportunities like this happening now to be on country and demonstrate and start the process of healing the landscape. Because that process is the research, that process is developing the employment, that process is acknowledging traditional knowledge, that process is also protecting our knowledge as we get more out on country and using that knowledge. And that protection of knowledge is also crucial, because the last thing that we want to see, and what's already been happening in this world, is the corporatizing things around the planet. And what we don't want to see is our knowledge and the roles of Aboriginal people and the opportunities be taken by other groups and corporatized and using machines to manage land and going down the road of taking away responsibilities, our natural responsibilities as human beings. And if that happens, then we again get left to the wayside, and we start to see opportunity fade away. And this is so important because at the moment, the Western world just sees fire as hazard reduction and fear. And that's all it's ever going to be if they keep on going down that road. But when we look at the Indigenous side of it, the fire is our friend. And we look at managing the land to keep it healthy. And it's about the plants, the animals, the soils, and that vital responsibility and custodianship to continue to manage that into the forevermore into the future. And that again is the legacy that we need to keep up and honor and take forward for our elders, but also for everyone's perspective, for humanity. It's so important. So when we look at our current works at the moment, yes, our main objective is to focus on communities to build their capacity to manage their own land. And that is the first and foremost thing. But through that, there are so many more opportunities for the communities to get involved. So we're also looking at the green economy around removing weeds and turning weeds and invasive natives into some sort of product like oils or biochar, things like that. We're also open the dialogue because a lot of communities doing this work are in built up areas and in developed areas. And so they have to work with non-Indigenous people, like farmers. Some people have got mining in their country. Some people have got forestry, and some people have just got private landholds or whatever, or townships and councils. And so every community is different in what they've got to deal with. But what we're finding over the years of work is that the traditional knowledge values fit into all of those. And when we look at all the different labels of fire, hazard reduction, biodiversity, or whatever they might come up with next, there's only one fire for country, and that's truly demonstrated through the knowledge that this knowledge supports all livelihoods on country, and that a healthy landscape supports all our needs and expectations as a whole within Aboriginal people to non-Indigenous people, and for the livelihoods and future preservation of our environment into the future, including the tasks that's needed to take on climate change and all these challenges ahead of us. The problem is huge, and not one of us can do it on its own. But what we've got to really make sure is that the opportunities are there for our people, and that the knowledge is respected, and that people do respect place and people, and that they've also got to understand that people are a part of country. And we're not just looking at healing country here, we're looking at healing people. And Aboriginal people have evolved with the land over 1,000 years, and the environment has evolved with them, which means that people are needed in the environment to undertake these responsibilities. Because over thousands of years of burning country, all the animals expect people to keep on doing that, and expect humans continue to that role to look after the country the right way. And in response, all the animals behave the right way, and in terms of coming to the fire and getting all the benefits from the fire, and all the vegetation comes back, and all of that fine knowledge of science within soils and timing with all the different ecosystems is all a part of making a healthy landscape. And it's something that the land's been used to for thousands of years. And when you take people out of the equation, then this is what happens, what you're experiencing right now. And, you know, and that's why it's so crucial that people are part of the environment and they go together. And what Western frameworks have been telling us is that we're separate from the environment and locking us out of the country, and that always looking from the outside in. And that's a handicap for everybody, because, you know, it shows that we're not a part of this planet, and we're not a part of the land, and we don't have a role to play within Mother Nature. And that is something that is totally wrong, and totally opposite to what's being demonstrated with the footsteps that have been laid before us over thousands of years from Aboriginal people and Indigenous people worldwide. So getting this ball rolling is really about Indigenous people making this happen for themselves, and to start that process of really providing that leadership, because this work can't be done in terms of reviving knowledge through Western science, because it's such a young knowledge system. They're still working out you know, how to do this work, how to work out with the land and the way it is. And you can't learn 40,000 or 80,000 years of knowledge within 250 years and work it out with Mother Nature. And that's why it's so important that we got no time to lose. And at the same time, if we're going to make these opportunities for our people, then we need to bring the rest of the nation with us. And we also need to show inclusiveness and where they fit in and how they can help. And so a lot of work now that we're doing is also working with people in the cities. They also equally need to know this knowledge and how they can contribute by being lawyers or being, you know, we've been doing stuff with architects and doing things with, you know, health programs and whatever, education, teachers, getting into schools, teaching kids. There are so many aspects and ways that we can support looking after our environment and communities better, no matter who we are, where we're from, as long as we're doing the right thing and supporting the right processes. And that's crucial for Aboriginal people, because that's something that Aboriginal people have in their being, in their ways, is sharing and caring. And when we look at, it's important that when you go to any Aboriginal community, you really are welcomed in, and they will even look after you. Just like Captain Cook got fed and taken care of, that is the nature, that's sharing and caring. And a big part of that is reconciliating a foreign person into the country to do the right thing and to follow those right laws. And it's really important that that we're following that in a modern sense as well to right now, but in a big scale. You know, we're working across South Australia now as well next year, and, you know, Tasmania, and, you know, there's been work in Western Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales and Queensland. There's also works happening, projects happening in Canada, working with a couple of communities over there as well. And you know, that's something that we haven't gone around and sort of gone, well, you should do this, do that. No, that's something that has come from demand of communities that are awakening and wanting to get on board and start doing this important work. So there's a huge shift, and it's such an exciting time. But with that comes the real need for partnerships and the real need for everyone to get on board and put their shoulders around or behind the right process, so that we don't lose the opportunities, so that knowledge doesn't get exploited, and so that we make sure that things happen and that we are making progress for our younger generations through education and getting the practical work done on country. And that's such a, you know, why we just go hammer and tong and try and, you know, kick goal after goal to try and get as many people involved to do the right thing, because that's what's going to safeguard our knowledge, is to get it really active in a big way amongst all the clan groups across the country. Yeah. Some of the work that we're doing is also we're creating cultural fire credits as well. We do see some of the credit schemes that are happening around the country, but like Ricky said, carbon and emission of carbon and stuff, that's not our main priority, but that's something that is also, the boxes are ticked when we look after the land. That's something that we take care of anyway. But like Ricky said, there's far more opportunities here. This links into food, links into, like I said before, education and all those realms. And so building an education model around our traditional knowledge systems is also important, so that our young people can contribute in all those different ways possible, and not just walking on country and lighting matches, which is what we love doing too. But there's so much more to that, and that's also demonstrates our traditional knowledge is so relevant in the modern world. And a lot of people make that mistake. They say, "Oh, Aboriginal knowledge is not, it's not applicable anymore. It's a different world now. The landscape's changed. People are different." And that's a whole lot of hogwash. The traditional knowledge will always be applicable, just like natural law will always be applicable. And those guidelines are crucial no matter how far in the future that we go. Because if we don't look after our country and if we don't look after our culture and people, then we become nothing. And even technology and even the greatest thing that has been invented by the rest of the world would not even exist. And it all comes from the same place, and that is country. And so, getting out there and working with farmers and agriculture sectors as well. And that's a really important one, and demonstrating that knowledge to the broader community and getting that recognition from the broader community, how important this knowledge is. And as an outcome, there's a huge following of non-Indigenous people that are supporting Aboriginal people the right way, because they feel inclusive and they feel like they're a part of the process, and they feel like they can help in some way, knowing that they respect people in place. And that's inevitable. It was also inevitable that we had to share this knowledge quickly and help communities because of the state that we're in Australia, with a lot of communities and with a loss of knowledge and so forth. And when we look at the problems within the environment and the pressure coming from society with all the alarm bells ringing, it was always a matter of urgency to record our elders' knowledge and get it out there. And that was long before climate change bells, And so getting it out there has been a risk to get people to actually see that knowledge and share knowledge with people we might not have wanted to share knowledge with. But it's been inevitable to be able to do that in such a short space, and trying to get things on the board and things up and running for a lot of communities. And
well, we've got lots of questions for you both. So I'm going to ask a very basic one to start with. Can you please describe the difference between burning country in the Aboriginal context versus hazard reduction burning? Who'd like to take that one? Ricky or Victor? Victor?
Yeah, okay. Well, when we look at hazard reduction, and like I said before, it's all just about hazard reduction. They look at the land as a threat. They look at the land as having too much fuel, and that's a threat to homes and livelihoods and to their modern society. And to tell you the truth, fear of fire has been the attitude of the Western mindset ever since colonization. I was just reading not long ago some reports that were based in 1839, right back then, and they were talking about how the Western people are frightened of fire right back then. And that has been something that has been taught to ongoing generations to this day, to fear fire. And so when hazard reductions happen, they're out there solely to protect people and solely to protect life and property. And when we look at fire in general, well, it's about that. Yeah, we look after the country so we don't get wildfire. And that's one of the outcomes for sure, just like the carbon. But more importantly is making country healthy. And it's not as simple as what they think. Oh, just burn country when it's dry. And so a lot of the hazard reduction burns are at the wrong time of year. And at the moment, there's hazard reduction burns going on in Southern Australia right now on country that I wouldn't even dare put fire. And as a result, there's more weeds that come up and the wrong type of seeds are ignited, different plants that don't belong in certain ecosystems start to come in there and creates a more flammable landscape. And it also diminishes the food sources and contributes to the mass extinction process within the landscapes. And some hazard reduction fellows might get it right here and there, but at the end of the day, the majority is contributing to worse wildfires and also diminishing the health of our landscapes. And let's face it, you know, like I said before, you know, they just can't work it out in 250 years. And, you know, and if only this country could listen and understand that, get their shoulders behind Aboriginal people and understand that this is for everyone to try and get this right across the country. They don't understand that at all, you know, and so it's a continuous battle. So there's a huge difference between hazard reduction and traditional burning.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Ricky, I'm going to direct the next question to you. Jay Cook has asked, what are the barriers to the adoption of Aboriginal burning practices by rural fire services and national parks, who seem to do most of the hazard reduction burns?
Yeah, thanks. Question. Some of this might follow on with some of the things Victor just mentioned, and look, paint that picture. We've had direct examples of some of these challenges. It's funny, you know, I was with Victor when done one of the first workshops up in Cape York 10 or so years ago, and there was a lot more challenges in terms of approvals and regulations and authorities for us to be able to do that. And at the time, Victor said, "Stuff it, let's do this anyway." And it took that to happen to be able to even get to, I think, where we are now. Now, obviously, there's lots of different legislations, policies and procedures in place against a national park or a conservation estate. And in this day and age, from a liability perspective, there are organisations and agencies that have to follow really strict rules. I'm not saying that we have to change those, but one thing around the barriers and the differences is we always hear about, let's try and fit traditional burning or Indigenous-led fire management into another label of hazard reduction, for example. Whereas if we just scrap the different labelings and give more importance and value to the traditional fire practice, in a way, it's going to solve your hazard reduction problems anyway. And it's, you know, some of these hazard reduction frameworks have been developed by really smart people, fire scientists and the rest of it, and the science and practice is right. But I think we miss the opportunity to highlight and value a knowledge system, as I mentioned, that's 80,000 plus years old, compared to one that's been going for, you know, not too long here in our country. So I think, again, there are barriers, there are different solutions to them. One thing is perceptions and respect go a long way in addressing some of those barriers.
Great.
That's right. And I just want to add to that too, is that, you know, it's not just the hazard reduction too, it's the ecological side of it as well. And that, you know, Aboriginal burning techniques is based on culture, spiritual, on hazard to stop wildfires from burning their resources. It's also most importantly though, it's about enhancing the plant and animal life, because people need to survive, and that's the food source, and that is the economy of the people, is a healthy landscape. And so we also see all of a sudden come out of the blue is ecological burning after they've come to all our workshops. And I've seen these people come in, write everything down, and then walk away and then start an ecological burning, excluding Aboriginal people. I mean, this is the sort of thing that we see a lot over the years, and things that we've been battling against to say, well, you can't just do that. You can't continue to separate things and continue to bastardize things, because not only is that disadvantage Aboriginal people, it's disadvantaging everybody. I mean, there's been a lot of lies based on the nation in terms of where we are today, and a lot of false information that also levels to where people of fear of fire. That's based on the wrong way of looking after the land and the wrong way of doing things. And so, you know, it's crucial that that we really get on top of this and simplify things. Simplify things in a way where there's one fire for country, the way Aboriginal people have been burning for thousands of years. This is Australia, and it ticks all the boxes, just like Ricky said, and there's 100% that can happen for sure.
Okay, I've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to go through them as quickly as I can. Catherine has a question. Catherine's just come online there. Do you want to ask your question directly? You're on mute.
Hi, hello everybody, but Victor and Ricky, thanks very much. Just wondering, are there differences in burning practices across Australia, thinking of the very different landscapes and the differing cultures? Not sure who could answer that. Just wonder. I don't need like precise detail, but love you to talk about that.
Yeah, there is different practices, not based on practices in terms like the foundation is the same. So when we look at Indigenous fire management, Aboriginal fire management, whatever you want to say, it's all based on the same principle, and that is to exactly what we've been talking about, to look after country, to make sure there's a lot of resources on the land, and that's and it's part of their culture and way of being. And that's the shared knowledge realm that we all share, the importance of that fire in our culture to manage our landscapes. But all the landscapes in different countries and different parts of Australia and even parts of the world have different landscapes. And that's where the things come differently, with a little bit of different timing, the different behaviors in the fire, all counting on the different types of climates they have and different tree species they have and soil types. And
Right.
it's the land that differs, that tells us what fires are going to be different and ways of how they behave, and the cultural knowledge fits hand in hand with that landscape.
Great, thank you. Next question I'm going to direct to Ricky. This is from Anita Smith. What governance or frameworks exist to protect Aboriginal knowledge of cultural burning practices?
Thanks, Anita, for the question. There's a number of things in place that, depending on scale, I'm not sure what the most relevant is, but the IP framework that I referred to, the Indigenous Cultural IP framework developed by Terry Jenke, is one of those overarching frameworks that we refer to a lot. Regardless of what IP or data management frameworks you go by, again, I always point back to the importance of following the proper protocols when you talk to traditional knowledge owners and practitioners, to be fully aware of the knowledge they are sharing and the intended purposes of that knowledge. I mean, even Victor can refer to a lot of work done in years ago around the recording and management of traditional knowledge, and we kind of took it in a way that there are different levels of privacy and security you can put in place on different systems, but it got to the point where a lot of the elders and traditional knowledge holders wanted to get that message and that exposure out there. What we have to be really careful of now, and this is where the question's more relevant, and I have talked to Victor a lot about this, is whenever there's a process where traditional knowledge becomes commercialised and a price gets put on that, and it goes against the concepts around sharing knowledge and passing on knowledge, there are always going to be issues that need to be addressed, because traditional knowledge, for me and in my perspective, it wasn't a commercial asset. It was an obligation that you had to pass on and to continue to have it there for future generations. So we need to look at commercial IP frameworks now in the day and age we are, because that is happening. It's happening right now. And again, there's some global frameworks that I'd point to, but the IP work that Terry Jenke has done is one of the flagship ones in Australia. I mean, it was targeted around Indigenous artworks to start with, but the concept does apply and transfer to traditional knowledge. but it's one I'm still learning. And I think as a sector, we are still learning about how to address some of the risks in the future. But I think if we go back to that foundation, that traditional knowledge was never meant to be a commercial asset that we sell and have a price tag on. It was an obligation and a responsibility that we had to transfer and, transfer that knowledge to future generations.
Ricky, it's Helen here. I didn't quite catch the name of the IP framework that you were referring to.
ICIP, Indigenous Cultural Intellectual Property. There's plenty of it online.
Thank you.
And like I said, there are a couple of other frameworks. Each state and territory also might have legislation in place that protects that. But again, one of the biggest problems is how we communicate and translate these different regulations and rules to people on the ground. When you consider a lot of these people, lucky to have old people sharing knowledge, English as a third, fourth language, no sort of concept of what the commercial aspects of traditional knowledge are. And sometimes that's a hard message to try and get across, because they don't see it as an issue, because they're just sharing their knowledge.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, and that's right. Like that employment of Aboriginal people, and that, and that commercializing our the knowledge as well, that's something that's inevitable in this day and time. And that's why I agree with Ricky, and we've got to get it right. And we've got to make sure we get it right for the future generations to be able to benefit from that. Because when we look at the employment, what you got to understand and what's happening through this process is that we're also changing the values of the work and the jobs that people are getting. When we look at the work that Aboriginal people get thrown at them is going into a mine and digging up their country. And the majority of them are not going to do that. Fell their trees or go do some work that goes against their values of looking after the land. And that is not meaningful work for us. And it's not work that we want to do, because, it just goes against that spiritual values and our cultural values. So when you look at the young people involved now in different countries in different places around the country, they're running up the hills to light the fires, and they're cutting out all the suckers, and they're doing this and that, and doing all this hard work. And some of the non-Indigenous people come over and go, oh, wow, look at them go. They're just working so hard. And I just say to them, why? It's because they're doing something that's meaningful. They're so happy that they actually got a job that not only is a job that feeds their families, but it's a job that brings back their identity and it nourishes their spirit. And as the end, that's the social improvements that come from happier people and happier lifestyles. And that is infectious when that is then passed on to non-Indigenous people. And when you look at it, the non-Indigenous work, they're doing jobs they don't want to do in a lot of sectors, and they're unhappy walking on the streets. And, this also is a lesson in employment opportunities that should be thousands of jobs based on work that is really fulfilling and spiritually rewarding, as well as so crucial to contributing to the future of this planet.
Thank you, Victor. I think you've just answered Jeff Ashley's question, was what opportunity does burning country bring to Aboriginal communities? Are there any further additions to that, or have we answered that?
Oh, look, the knowledge map is huge. You have water, plants, animals, ceremony, dance, music, art, food, cooking, the list goes on. Architecture, we mentioned before, law, we got Terry Janke working in law. We've got the monitoring, the scientists. We're looking at PhDs for people and communities to monitor the progress on their country, and scholarships. It just goes on and on and on. And that is the abundance that comes from the universe. And that is the natural abundance that is always there if we get that niche right, just like Aboriginal people have done for thousands of years.
That's great. Another question. So this is from Rachel Jackson. What impacts has climate change had on burning practices?
Well, for climate change impacts on burning practices, well, I can tell you that as a practitioner and as burning country in many parts of around Australia for many years now, So almost going on to 30 years now, burning country to this day. And I can tell you that it hasn't affected the way that we read the land, and it hasn't affected the way that we apply the knowledge to country. We just adapt and adjust that method by reading landscapes. And that's why the knowledge is so important, to be able to read country, to be able to understand the trees, the soils, the animals, the breeding. All of that is crucial to fire management. And if you don't know that knowledge, then you don't know how to adapt and shift your burning patterns to the changes and unprecedented changes to land. And that's why it's so important for climate change, because climate change has been happening for a long time, and it's about adaptation. And adaptation is what Aboriginal people have been boss of and really good at. And that's why it's been able to be sustainable for so long.
Thank you. Stuart Reid asks, how does burning fit into the broader scope of Aboriginal land management practice? Is it inherent in all Aboriginal peoples across Australia?
Ricky?
Yeah, maybe just to start, there were some of the things I did touch on in my talk around, what I thought how it fit in to that bigger system. And there are some places and some different peoples that maybe don't do fire management to the extent that other groups may do. And following on from the example of climate change and some of those challenges, we still talk to groups that are in the past gone through drought, flood, whatever else. They might not have any grass on their country, but they still want to talk about fire management because of all the things that fire management brings. And it's funny, direct example, we got Victor down to Western New South Wales and I was down there, and the place we were looking at burning, you could count the little patches of grass on one hand. But it just shows the importance of talking about fire, because it is part of a much bigger system. Because that country is not going to be like that forever. Like the people and like the knowledge system we talked about, Victor said, it adapts. The country adapts as well. So, they might have been in drought with bugger all grass, 5 years ago, but, a couple of good wet seasons and a different regime, and there's grass there. So if they didn't start with those discussions before, they wouldn't be in a place now to be able to implement a fire practice. So around that point of, being adaptive, that's just ingrained with the culture of Indigenous people. That's what we've done. And the same way we look at all of the science that what we're being told about climate change, which I fully agree with, but it's the aspect of adaptation that we sometimes undervalue, because the country is adapting, the people are adapting, and because Indigenous people are so closely linked to their country, they can adapt together, and that can help solve some of those issues.
There's a question here from Megan Lawrence, which is an extension of Stuart's question. Is it inherent in other First Nation communities overseas, the practice of fire management?
Yes.
She
It's
says
like I said
based on
before.
Victor's work overseas.
Yes, like I said before, it's all the same principles. And I've been honoured to be able to travel to Finland with the Sami, to to the States and to Canada and other places in New Zealand, and listen to elders in those places. And it's it's the same foundation in terms of what I said, in terms of problems with getting knowledge acknowledged, and the same problems with the landscapes, the lack of traditional foods going missing. And it's the same process in terms of getting that traditional practices back. And that's why it's so important that what you got to understand, this is not just about fire. The title that we're talking about here really is about rebuilding knowledge from landscapes. All of our knowledge comes from landscapes. And so it's a very particular type of exercise when you work with elders in any part of the world and on their own country to try and rebuild that knowledge with them that has been lost in the past. And that's where we share indicators within soils, trees, which is timing for different soils and different types of grasses. And when we're able to share that knowledge together in indicators, we're able to rebuild and join the dots and fulfill the cup rather than being the cup half empty. And that reviving knowledge from landscapes, that is a practice, like I said before, that can't be done with Western science because they don't have that knowledge base. It can only be done by Indigenous knowledge, supporting Indigenous knowledge. And that's why, you know, I really want to build more practitioners and build up more of that and get more elders who have got knowledge involved in different places to start that process of strengthening that revival process of knowledge of landscapes. Because once they start that process, you want to see them change. You know, they start to remember things. They start to see the knowledge that they do have. It even goes from there to there because they get to join the dots of all the different knowledge on their country from sharing knowledge. And then when we ultimately light the fire, and the fire does exactly what we say, it goes out where we say it's going to go out, it behaves the way it's going to behave. And ultimately the animals come back and the grasses come back and foods come back. Then they're the indicators that Mother Nature and the land is then teaching the people, and then helping to get that true knowledge and get that right knowledge as close as possible that our ancestors had on country. So that reviving knowledge, I've been doing that in Canada, and that's the process I've been using all over Australia as well, with helping communities reviving their knowledge. And what's really exciting too is that the language connects to that. And so when we got, like, for example, the Jabbergai mob up here in North Queensland, when I went out on country with them, they bring their linguist out for the Jabbergai language. And when I started to show the fire and then show the white smoke, they had language words that they didn't know the meaning of. All of a sudden they knew the meaning of because they saw the practice on country. So language lines up, you know, the land and the indicators in the land line up, and the language of the land, and then all the knowledge that they do have of their culture all line up to enhance that knowledge and go from there to there with their knowledge. And that's why it's so empowering, and that's why it's so exciting for a lot of the mob. And that transition also happens with non-Indigenous people too, when they, like farmers, when they realize they've been farming the wrong way and actually look at this sort of knowledge and go, well, I thought I knew this land after 3 generations, but I don't really know the land after listening for half an hour and understanding that I've actually been contributing to the shorter end of the stick. So that reviving knowledge from landscapes, that is the key, because Mother Nature and the planet, Mother, that's where we get the knowledge from, country. And that's country, and the land has been out of this conversation since colonization. And so a big part of the work that we do is bringing, and what all Aboriginal people do, is having the land having a voice, and that the land tells us what to do. And that's how we adapt and get our adaptation. And that's what tells us when to burn, whatever we do. And it's not a textbook. It's not sitting in offices looking at maps. And it's definitely not based on decisions of research projects that have developed outcomes from the wrong processes of looking at land.
I think this one relates to your last comment. I've got a question from Linda Feinberg. This week is the part 1 of the UN Biodiversity Conference. Do you know if this important message you are sharing today is being taken to that conference? Also, how can organisations such as ICOMOS support you?
Ricky, you want to go first?
Yeah, look, thanks, Linda. Good to see you online. I've been involved with Linda in the past with other hats on, and it has come up. NAILSMA is involved in a couple of global things. Half of them I can't remember, but one of them are IUCN. We're part of the Indigenous Peoples Organisations group that have recently, we had what's the big do they had in France, in Marseille, the World Conservation Congress, and there's been a couple of other global platforms over the last few years where there's been opportunities to strengthen the message that we're talking about here in Australia and at a smaller scale. What I do notice is there's a big opportunity, but there's also a big challenge. Sometimes it's easier for me to go overseas and talk about what we're doing here, and we get more respect and support at a global level. Then we come back to our own backyard and we put up with all the same struggles and challenges we have to. there are a number of opportunities in how we can strengthen this message at a global scale. And what I'd want to do is turn it around to how we can get that global message and that opportunity to fix things in our backyard, because we're still fixing them. There's an opportunity I think we can do at state and territory scale, or even Australia, a lot stronger than we currently are. All of the questions we talked about today about, barriers against uptake of systems, legislative barriers, things like that. We sometimes look at the global platform to help solve a lot of those problems, and it does give it good exposure. But if we don't turn that back around to fix something in practice on the ground here in our backyards, we miss that opportunity. So definitely there's ways that ICOMOS and other platforms can help this message. But a key thing I'd be looking at is we got people in Australia that need to hear that before the global audience. So I'm not sure how we weigh up who's a priority.
Okay, I've just got a couple more questions. I don't know if we'll get through everybody today, but I'll do my best. We have a question from Japan. Do Aboriginal people have any myths, beliefs, or sacred sites associated with the god of fire, or something to do with burning or revival of land? So I'm guessing this relates to your Dreamtime stories, but I'll let you answer.
Yes, I'll go to you.
Yes, of course.
Of course.
And that's all part of culture. And every clan group got a different story, got a different fire song, fire dance, and not just fire, all kind of dances that's related to landscapes and animals and totems, and there's a lot of story places on country as well, women's story places and men's story places, and women's story places where the women look after the country, and so women have a big role in the fire too, in Australia here. So there's a big role out here for the women, and I really want to just state that while I'm answering this question, that they're playing a really active role, and that's also based on that cultural, identity within landscapes. So the answer is yes, and it's evolving. There's communities that are evolving their art and evolving their knowledge now. As they revive knowledge from landscapes, it helps them to not only revive knowledge, but also to evolve their cultural practices into the future. And that's also really important for that cultural nourishment and that joy and appreciation and celebration along the way as we heal our landscapes and people.
Yeah, and just to add, I agree, and it was good. I was flicking through the questions and answers, really interested in seeing an answer come from Japan. So thanks for the question. And it kind of links back to what I was talking about, the cultural authority and cultural frameworks. They are based on on traditional ceremonial stories and mythology that have been put into a system. We hear about creation stories and the Dreamtime. It's probably a bit more tangible than we sometimes think, because a lot of the stories that were painted on a wall or talked about in oral sort of histories and stories and language have given us the tools and information to an on-ground practical activity such as burning. So it's linked from that myth or from that creation story to an actual on-ground activity. And it's just, sometimes we don't, again, value the full story of where some of these practices come from. But it's really good to talk about, because we sometimes don't get the chance to talk about it. So thanks for the question.
Excellent.
I'd like to say thanks as well. I've never been asked that question from Japan, so thanks.
Is everybody happy to just go a few minutes longer? We did start a little bit late. Is that okay, Helen?
I think we should. I think this is really interesting.
There's some terrific questions.
If you can, we might lose some people on the way, but I think it's worth persevering. Okay,
so the next one's from Chris Johnson. Aboriginal use of fire is often referred to as cultural fire. Some people interpret this narrowly, as though this doesn't include the broader cultural responsibilities of country that Ricky highlighted. Would there be value in describing Aboriginal fire as an Indigenous technology to help expand a wider appreciation of its purposes and connection to the system of traditional knowledge?
Well, I'll have a crack at it first because I did read this question. I really like the suggestion in
Sorry, I
there.
missed that question.
It's from Chris Johnson. Some people interpret this narrowly. Aboriginal use of fire is often referred to as a cultural fire. Some people interpret this narrowly as though this doesn't include the broader cultural responsibilities for caring for country that Ricky highlighted. Would there be value in describing Aboriginal fire as an Indigenous technology to help expand a wider appreciation of its purpose and connection to the system of traditional knowledge?
Oh, look, there's always putting up new names and new things. I mean, we talked about that before, I mean, Indigenous knowledge is Indigenous knowledge, and we'd like it to be framed that way. And I think it's really good that we can just continue to plug into different sectors and to demonstrate that the value of that knowledge in different fields. And I think the more we continue with that, the more people will recognize, just how important it is in so many ways. And, we're sort of happy with it in traditional knowledge. We don't really like too much changes within our knowledge. We've had cultural burning come up as well, and the cultural burning, and that's something that we're not used to in the north, but was something that has happened from the southern areas and of Australia. And we like to simplify things, and that's going to be an important part of moving forward. Really important part of all our differences, ensuring that we're talking that same language of our elders into the future too. I don't know, Ricky might have a...
Yeah, just to add on to that, I agree with what Victor's saying. At times it is good when we can put some different labels on certain things, but again, it brings that same example where we're changing the stuff we've got to fit under other labels. And again, the more we do that, we take away from that focus to what we think it really is to start with. And that's not just what me and Victor think, but this is what we're hearing from people on the ground, from other practitioners, from other knowledge holders. And we just have to get out of that cycle of trying to fit under other things and other labels. As I mentioned, we lose the value in when we do that. But some of I think there are some opportunities to how we can better tell the story and highlight certain things. But like I said, we've done enough of kind of changing labels and fitting under other labels, as much as I like that terminology around Indigenous technology. But I don't think we have to give it that name specifically, because, the system of traditional knowledge, it is a technology. But the more we take away different aspects or different terminology around the whole system, we lose the strength of it as that full system of traditional knowledge, traditional science.
Okay. Maddie Miller has sent through a question. Do you feel that governments are changing their regulatory frameworks in meaningful ways to accommodate mob on country in fire and other country practice?
Look, I'll start. I think Victor's having issues with his connection down there. Again, I'll refer back to each state, territory, down to even regions, has different legislation from a liability perspective that they have to adhere to. And again, we all know the importance of managing risks and liabilities and threats and damages from fire. But I think we have to use the examples that have happened and that we can learn from. Like I mentioned, if Victor didn't say, all those years ago up in Cape York, all right, stuff it, I'm just going to light this fire anyway because these old fellas want me to light it, we wouldn't have got to where we were in that example. Obviously, there are some, implications that might be negative if we went and done that in this day and age. And, you know, in the example of liability and risk management, we have to be strategic to how we address some of those barriers. But again, sometimes it's more about changing perceptions than it is about changing legislation. And again, if it's not done in a collaborative way that respects the traditional knowledge and cultural protocols, we're always going to have issues with it. So I think there are opportunities on different states. Some have been a lot more supportive than others, and that's not having a crack at different states or different organisations or departments. It's just to show that there are differences out there. What works in one place might not work elsewhere, but wherever possible is you revert back to the local cultural governance and protocol procedures in place and follow them. And then we can use our neighbours and networks to how they might help and support, you know, that developing from there.
Okay. So this one is from Elise Huffer.
Catherine seems to have frozen there. Question for Ricky. How do you convince non-Aboriginal people or institutions to view fire practices as part of a whole system so it's not extracted and bastardised, as Victor said? Vinica from Elise Huffer.
Yeah, thanks, Bulla. Someone in Fiji joining us. Look, good question. Some of the answers to that Victor did touch on. And look, we see a lot of bastardisation of various things in traditional knowledge happening. You know, some of the issues I talked about and with Victor earlier around even the commercialisation of things. But in terms of, you know, convincing non-Aboriginal people, and I suppose that's supported by the fact I was saying sometimes the story around fire and uptake is about changing perceptions rather than, you know, trying to do an evidence-based kind of argument around why we need to burn. It's just sometimes people's life view and perception on the way Indigenous people use fire has to be addressed first. The easiest way, in my view, for this to happen, so it isn't bastardised, is let us do it. Let Victor do it. Let Fire Sticks do it. Let the appropriate, relevant structure in whichever part of the country you're working on, let them lead it and let them implement it, because they'll do it the way they want to do it based on their cultural protocols and their obligations. And the more that we can strengthen the things that they want to do and the system how they do it, we've got more chance of that being integrated into these other institutions so they can fully value it, not just from the perspective of their own organisation, but from the traditional owner perspective, from the skills and the knowledge that they have.
Right.
And also, if I can add on to that a little bit, you know, it's also important that that we're building partnerships as well to support the traditional owners, and that those partnerships are there. Just last week, we just partnered up with Suncorp, which is quite a corporation. It's a bank in Australia, and that's been a fantastic partnership. There's other partnerships that we're developing, and the more partnerships that we can build around this, with so many partnerships, then that's going to help us to shift governments and to get the right resources to kick more goals, but more importantly, get more people on board to create this cultural shift, because this is about a cultural shift deep down inside, changing the culture so that people are reminded every day how they connect to the land and how we all contribute to the solutions, and that's something that should be a cultural shift as a whole for non-Indigenous and Indigenous people around that. And so partnerships are really important, because here in Australia, the government is not really doing enough to support this process. I can say nowhere near enough. And it's been the philanthropy and partnerships and all the communities, non-Indigenous and Indigenous on the ground, that have gotten to the point where it is now. And I just feel that we need to snowball that even more to ensure that we get governments in any area on board the right way.
Thank you. We have a couple of other questions related to flora and fauna. Jodie Hannon has asked, she's interested in your thoughts on how introduced plants and animals, so weeds and rabbits and pigs, can be brought into balance in country.
Look, I'll have a go to start with, given I have got an interest in pigs. With another hat on, I chair the National Feral Pig Action Plan Committee, looking at a national scale plan about how to manage pigs. In terms of finding the balance in country in regards to pigs, that balance for me is found from a bullet and reduction of feral animals and threats such as pigs. Again, trying not to be controversial, but there have been systems and country where we've adapted to things like feral animals and the effects they made. But again, I'll revert back to that comment around traditional owners are always going to have an obligation to care for their country. And if caring for their country is removing different threats, such as weeds and animals, such as pigs and invasive pests, then they will always look to do that because it's something that is standing in the way of them and healthy country. You know, obviously there's different challenges, barriers, rules around how you manage things. But my view would be you can find a balance, but that has to come from a hard stance on how you manage those invasive threats. And again, managing feral animals and weeds costs a lot of money. In a way, it costs more than fire. Fire, you can buy a box of matches and that's it. You got a fire. To manage weeds, to manage pigs, that's a large-scale activity that can become really costly. So again, when we look at some of the economic opportunities that fire brings, you know, such as a fire credit example that Victor said they're working on, and things like savanna burning methods and carbon farming outcomes, it's not so much about let's reduce emissions, it's about getting investment to be able to look after your country. So in a way, that's a balance there. If you can make money through fire while you're still, you know, doing cultural obligations and practices, it then gives you the resources to be able to address these other matters like invasive plants and animals. Again, some things might work different in different country, but for me, if I've got a feral buffalo or a feral pig or a feral threat on my country, my main role is to get rid of it. And the balance will be found, you know, eventually, but as it is now, it's still a struggle and a challenge that we need to manage.
Great. Sherry Lee Evans has asked, can you see branching out of your programs to addressing other key missing elements in the landscape, such as first order predators like the dingo?
I missed that question, sorry. Yeah.
Sherry Lee Evans has asked, can you see branching out of your programs to addressing other key missing elements in the landscape, such as first order predators like the dingo?
Yeah, that's right. The absence of the dingo has been a big problem with feral animals and allowing feral animals into a lot of areas around Australia. Farmers have been shooting them. They've been a part of this country for a few thousand years now, and you know, they're part of the environment here. And I, you know, it'd be great to see putting dingoes back in places where they've been taken out to help support the feral animal problems. And also with the weeds and stuff, you know, the fire plays a big role in getting rid of the weeds too. And a lot of biotechniques of getting rid of weeds and pests come from fire too. And a lot of those biotechniques we're using within the organic farming projects that we're involved in, because they can't use chemicals. And so we're working we've been really successful with cancelling a lot of weeds and a lot of feral plants that don't belong on country through the right fire. And I won't go into all the detail around it. There's quite a lot of science involved in the different temperatures and soils and different ecosystems and timing. But at the end of the day, it's possible that fire can really enhance our biotechniques in dealing with weeds and also invasive natives that are creating monocultures in certain ecosystems. So, you know, we can reduce the amount of poisons immensely.
Okay, great. There's just one last one here. It's about for national parks. New South Wales national parks for the last 20 years have done prescribed burning, which is burning designed to address land management issues, often with particular species, because individual species have different fire frequency and fire intensity requirements in order to thrive. Does this work well with Aboriginal burning?
Maybe Victor, I'll go to you, given your experience with New South Wales Parks and Wildlife.
We've lost you. You're muted.
No, he's just muted.
Could you just tell me that question again?
Yes, it was, for the last 20 years, New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Services done burning for individual species that have different fire frequency and fire intensity requirements. How does that fit with Aboriginal practice?
Yeah, it doesn't fit at all. Again, it's that Western framework where they separate everything. And that's been a problem with conservation in this country, of singling out things. And as a result, they've come up with a blanket management across the landscape. And so they do like 7 years, you don't burn this ecosystem in 7 years, you don't burn this ecosystem in 10 years, and so forth. And all based on one species of plant that doesn't flower for 7 years. And the truth of the matter is that after 7 years, there's too much fuel buildup and they lose everything after the fire. And that time frame is just too long and creates too hot a fire and causes more harm than good. And it's another example of separation and how bad it is, and not seeing things as interconnected and how everything is linked, and that one form of management benefits every living thing in that ecosystem. And when we burn country, we don't burn the trees. There's a law around not burning canopies, and we don't harm those plants anyway, or animals, and creating the right types of smoke so that the bees don't swarm, and so there's a cool grass smoke that comes to say it doesn't harm the bees, so that they can harvest the honey, which is really important, that honey. And that's why the right fires and burning the right vegetation is really important, for the right types of smoke as well, and the right heat in the fires and the right temperatures in the soils. They have not based any of their findings on any of their knowledge. And it's really frustrating when I hear these sort of things where they're burning every 7 years and just looking at one species when all the rest of the species suffer from that outcome. And there's a lot of examples of that. And this is where conservation, you know, and unknowingly starts to contribute to extinction of and degradation of land. And the conservation has been a big part of destroying this country, I'm afraid. So, you know, it hasn't been good. A lot of the conservation decisions in this land around fire and other practices.
Okay.
Even just to add to that, from a practical perspective, when we look at that example of say, a national parks agency doing a regime based on different species and all these different systems, just purely from an efficiency perspective, traditional knowledge and practices are the most efficient management things going. You know, that's a really costly exercise to be able to do different regimes based on different species, where if you scale it back and try to be more efficient with the time and availability of people and land when you've got it, it's that system that looks after, if you do it right, all of the country, not just one little species here or there, or one thing here or there. Because the importance of species by different definitions could be what's listed on the threatened species list, or what's threatened ecologically or scientifically. But from an Indigenous perspective, all of those species are culturally important, and they've got their different levels of significance. So if you manage it appropriately using those cultural governance and cultural protocols and those frameworks, you're naturally looking after all of those species anyway. You don't have to just do a fire on a certain day or week for, the hairy nose, whatever, because if you do it properly, you're going to look after it all.
Excellent.
That's exactly right. And that's, we can't emphasize on that enough, that, when you, and I agree with Ricky, the feasibility and the costs will go down in managing our land if we have our land healthier. And if we are managing this way, where we're looking at holistic management systems that are interconnected with every living thing on country. And that's what Aboriginal land management is. It's finding that fine groove of being part of the landscape, and that one action of applying that action of management that benefits every living thing on that country. And that, again, is going to prove more cost efficient in the future. And it's also just so important that that's further demonstrated, because like I said before, that's separating our land. We're tired of it. We can't allow that separating and that ongoing labeling and new concepts around our knowledge that when it's been stable for thousands of years.
Great, thank you very, very much. And there's lots of very positive comments coming through in the chat box to say how much people have really appreciated your knowledge and sharing of that today, and how much people have learnt from you today. So, and what a wonderful session it's been for people. So I just wanted to share that with you. So I think it's time we close. So we've gone quite a bit over time now, and I think we've covered most of the questions. So I'm just going to see if I can share my screen again. Because what I have on there is just the two books that our two speakers have contributed to, so people can see. Let's see if I can get this coming up again.
We need it full screen, Catherine.
Yes, I'm just trying to make that happen. I think I have to get rid of the question box. Here we go. So you see that now?
That's the question. Yeah, that's right.
Yes, so I just really would like to thank our speakers. I think just the understanding that burning is just part of a much, much bigger concept of how we manage country and how we actually take care of country, and also it takes care of us to a certain extent. And we've clearly heard how Aboriginal people have a deep knowledge and understanding of our land and what it needs to be resilient, and that this knowledge has been developed over thousands of generations, and we have a lot to learn from that. Through Indigenous-led projects, there's an opportunity to work together to better understand the science behind caring for country and to find solutions to global issues such as climate change. And in working with First Nations people, it's important to recognise the local protocols and work within local governance frameworks. And so these are the two books that our two speakers have been involved with. One is Our Knowledge, Our Way in Caring for Country. So that talks about Indigenous-led research and how we can work together, and Victor's book on Fire Country. And I found reading Fire Country, I learned a huge amount about land management and in that book, and just how important it is to understand the land in a really holistic fashion and work with it. So they're the two books, and I just really like to thank our two speakers, Ricky Archer and Victor Stephenson. I'd also like to thank Jeff Ashley, who helped in setting up this whole webinar and in doing some of the preliminary research for it. Jay Cook for all the graphics. I'd also like to thank all the photographers that allowed us to use their beautiful images on burning, and Helen and Kerame for all their coordination and technical assistance, the Caring for Country Committee, and ICOMOS for hosting this webinar. So Helen, do you want to quickly introduce next month's webinar, and then we'll have to say farewell?
Yes, yes, I'd like to. I'd also like to thank Catherine for all her work setting up, organising and moderating this webinar. She's done a lot. It's been wonderful. So the next webinar is Community Resilience and Traditional Practices Adapting to Climate Change in the Pacific Islands. We'll circulate information on this in the coming weeks. If you have any questions or queries for us or for the speakers, please contact us at the email on the slide, caringforcountry.web@gmail.com. Webinar recordings will be available on the ICOMOS website, icomos.org, under Webinars, Heritage and Climate Change. The recording of webinar 1 is up on the ICOMOS website now, and webinar 2 will be up there very shortly. And then the recording of this webinar will be up shortly after that. So keep an eye on it. Thank you very much for coming, everyone, and bearing with us over this long period. And goodbye, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.